Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. We have just gotten back from LG Display at Computex 2026. They didn't have a booth on the show floor this year, but we were invited to their office to take a nice private look at some of their upcoming technologies and also to get more details on their current technologies. This was actually probably the most interesting thing that I saw at the show because LG Display had a ton of details for us. Many more talks about, future technologies, future things that they're doing, and all things that we can actually share with you guys today than a lot of the other manufacturers. So we're going to be diving into some of the panels that they're coming up with in the next couple of years. We're going to be talking about some panel coatings. We're going to talk about some of the panels that they've got today and some of the differences and performance expectations that we have for those displays. It's a really interesting chat, so let's get into it after this.
Our 2026 Computex coverage is brought to you by MSI and their GeForce RTX 50 series graphics cards, including flagship models like the Supreme Liquid and Vanguard, both of which delivered class-leading results in our testing. Powered by NVIDIA's Blackwell architecture, RTX 50 series GPUs are the ultimate way to experience ray tracing, delivering more realistic lighting and visual fidelity than ever before. You'll also benefit from AI-powered DLSS 4.5 frame generation and NVIDIA Reflex for smoother, more responsive gameplay. So for more information on MSI's GeForce RTX 50 series of graphics cards, please check the links in the video description. Finally, a big thank you to G.Skill for helping to make our Computex trip possible this year. G.Skill offers an outstanding range of DDR5 memory with AMD Expo and AMD Expo featuring ultra-low latency support specifically designed to maximize AMD Ryzen performance. So for more information, please check the links in the video description.
So the thing that caught my eye the most at LG Display here at the show was their new 27-inch 1440p 540Hz panel that they're working on that is certified for Display HDR True Black 1000. So currently what LG Display provide and also what Samsung Display provide with QD OLEDs are things like True Black 400, True Black 500, and now we're starting to see True Black 600 class products. Well, LG Display are working on something with True Black 1000 spec. So what does that mean? Well, that means up to 2000 nits of peak brightness at a 1.5% APL window and up to 560 nits of full screen, full white window brightness to go along with other usual certifications. True Black 1000 implies a 10% window size of 1000 nits, so we should also be expecting that with LG Display's panel. What was immediately obvious going into LG Display's room was the brightness of this particular panel. It was extremely bright compared to a lot of the previous WOLEDs that I've looked at, and that made it immediately stand out. So even though you might think, can I really tell the difference between 1000 nits or 1500 nits and 2000 nits? Well, you definitely can, at least based on what I saw in that room. A lot of the other details that we got is that this is using an RGWB subpixel layout, so it is tandem WOLED technology, the very latest technology that LG provide. However, RGWB, and that's because with the inclusion of that white subpixel, LG are able to hit higher brightness levels than some of the RGB stripe versions that they've produced in other formats. So for these high brightness configurations that we're going to be seeing both, I guess, in the next couple of years and also today, for that they're still needing to use the RGWB subpixel layout. What was interesting was some of the descriptions about what it means to be True Black 1000 and hit 2000 nits of peak brightness. They were actually comparing the 27-inch panel size at 2000 nits with 83-inch TV formats with 10,000 nits of brightness. Their thinking being that you use a monitor panel much closer up, and so 2000 nits of brightness has about the same impact as using an 83-inch panel, but a bit further away, but that hits 10,000 nits. So yeah, that was quite interesting information from LG. Now, of course, with this panel, there's no time frame for when it's going to be available or when it's coming. They're still talking about, doing some engineering work to ensure that it works perfectly. There are, of course, concerns around things like burn-in and panel retention when being used at 2000 nits and that sort of thing. So they're still putting in a lot of work to make this a reality. However, it is something that LG Display can do. So at the show, LG Display aren't really advertising things to people like the media, while they did have a couple of media tours planned. Mostly what they do is they go to customers. So you think of companies like Dell, LG Electronics, a separate division of LG, Gigabyte, Asus, these companies, and they say, hey, we're working on a True Black 1000 gaming monitor panel. Are you guys going to be interested? Should we keep developing this technology? And so, yes, no time frame for this specific panel, but that's why they were showing it at the show. Also at LG Display was a 27-inch 5K WOLED panel using the RGB stripe subpixel layout, of course tandem WOLED tech like all the things that they were showing off. So this is a 5120 by 2880 panel at a 27-inch size. Now this panel is largely designed for it seemed to be more creator focused. So thinking of, monitors designed to be used with MacBooks and also potentially for productivity systems. So the panel that they were showing had a 120 Hz refresh rate. The brightness specs for this panel are 1000 nits at a 1% window, so that's peak brightness spec, 500 nits at a 10% APL, and 250 nits full screen brightness. So this fits with the Display HDR True Black 400 class, very similar to what we see from LG Display's new 32-inch RGB stripe panels and the 27-inch 4K RGB stripe. So similar spec in the 5K format, of course, with a slightly higher pixel density. Now, when it comes to the refresh rate being 120 Hz, as I mentioned, largely designed for productivity apps, what they were showing. However, this is something that it isn't a final spec. They say they can do 120 Hz, but they can also potentially do higher than that if a customer requests to do so. So if it came, someone like ASUS like, hey, we want to make a 5K WOLED gaming monitor, can you do that at 240 Hz? LG Display say, hey, we'll try work on that and get that working for you. Dual frame rate is also something that they can add in at a customer's request. So the panel they were showing did not support, for example, a 1440p dual mode. However, because DFR or dual mode is part of LG Display's portfolio, again, if someone like ASUS was like, I want to make a 5K WOLED gaming monitor, can you increase the refresh rate and provide a 1440p dual mode configuration? LG Display say that is 100% possible. So again, it was quite interesting to see LG Display produce this panel. We've also heard that Samsung Display are working on a similar 5K QD OLED that they're going to be producing, so there is going to be competition for this. However, like with the True Black 1000 display, no confirmed time frame on this particular panel, and they're just in talks with customers about how it's going to look, how it's going to work out for them. A lot of the other things that they had on show were more technically focused, so a lot of details about some of the various different panel formats that they can offer, which I think is really interesting. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we saw. One related to panel coatings. We all know about matte versus glossy and about QD OLED versus WOLED in terms of reflectance and those sort of things. Well, what LG Display was showing at this Computex little booth thing that they had was 4 different coatings that they'll be offering to customers throughout 2026 and 2027 for monitor customers. So they had the AGLR coating. This is your standard matte coating that we've seen a lot. LG Electronics often use this for their monitors. This has 1.7% reflectance as well as a 35% haze. So again, the matte coating you've all seen before, that's on show here as well. They've also got their standard AR coating, so anti-reflectance coating. This has 1.1% reflectance and a 0% haze. This is the exact technology that ASUS use with True Black Glossy, Gigabyte with Real Black Glossy. LG Display offer that for customers. It was on show. But the thing that really caught my eye was a new coating that they'll be offering for different display vendors, which is called SAR, or Super Anti-Reflectance. This reduces the reflectance level from 1.1% on the AR coating to 0.3% with this SAR coating, still with a 0% haze. And so essentially this is LG's attempt to get the reflectance of the glossy panels more in line with QD OLED. As we know, QD OLEDs have issues with ambient light reflectivity, but the actual mirror-like finish is quite muted on a QD OLED screen, so you don't get a lot of, if there's a window nearby your display, you're not really seeing a lot of that in the reflectance of the panel. And what we saw from this particular SAR coating looked really good in terms of reducing the mirror finish and that sort of thing. It did come with a couple of trade-offs though, compared to the AR coating, so ASUS True Black Glossy. One was that while it's not nearly as bad as a QD OLED in terms of raising blacks and things like that, the black levels under strong direct lighting to the front of the display wasn't quite as good as the AR coatings. That seems to be a small trade-off there. Again, it's nowhere near as bad as QD OLED, so don't panic, don't go, oh my God, we're gonna get raised blacks from LG WOLED panels. Absolutely isn't gonna be happening. However, under that direct lighting condition, we shone some studio light straight at the screen, slightly raised blacks compared to the AR coating, but still it looked really good in my opinion. There was also a very slight color tint when we shone lights directly at it. The AR coating was perhaps more red to purple tint slightly, with the SAR coating slightly more maybe purplish blue with the way it handled things, but I thought it looked really good. So that's going to be an option for people. And the other thing that they shown off was what they were calling the fighter reflection, which isn't as technical, but essentially this is a film that can be applied to LG Display's panels. It has a 4.4% reflectance and 3% haze. So it's not a matte coating like AGLR, which had 35% haze, but it's slightly hazy and it's slightly glossy. So this is, I guess, similar to that ASUS monitor we saw, one of the first glossy WOLEDs. I think it was the XG27AQ RGW, something like that. I forget the name right now. Maybe Balin can put it on screen for you later. So what ASUS had with that 3% haze glossy finish, LG Display also going to be offering something similar to that for their customers going forward. However, what LG Display tell me is that they are targeting this fighter coating for mainstream entry-level products. So it is slightly cheaper to manufacture than the AR, AGLR, and SAR coatings. So if a monitor vendor is targeting a mainstream product or an entry-level product, but they still want to offer something that's, maybe a little bit glossy, sort of in between the two offerings, this fighter coating is a film instead of a different surface treatment, helps keep the cost down, but still offer a nice surface treatment for people. So I thought that was interesting. So we learned a lot about LG Display's plans for other panel formats, some which are currently available and some which are coming soon, at this little booth private suite tour as well, which I think is really interesting. You guys might find interesting as well. So one of the stars of the show this year is, of course, the new 39-inch 5120 by 2160 panel, the new 5K, 2K ultra-wide. You will have seen that in both the RGWB subpixel version that LG Electronics are using with the matte coating, as well as the RGB stripe version that Dell are using with the glossy panel coating. And essentially what LG Display were telling us is that both of these panel versions are on offer for vendors to use. It depends on the exact timings that they can offer them, but they are indeed, both versions are available. And this choice between the RGWB and RGB will also be available for a couple of their other different panel variants. So the 32-inch version as well, that will continue to be available in the RGB stripe and the RGWB, but a format like 45-inch tandem WOLED, for example, that is only going to be available in RGWB. So it just depends on the things that they feel is appropriate for each different panel version. However, LG Display always say they're listening to customer feedback, and if a customer wants a particular panel format with RGB stripe, they will definitely consider that. So what we did learn is that LG Display are planning a panel refresh of the 45-inch 5K 2K format, which we saw towards the start of 2025. That of course has WOLED technology in the version that we've got today, but they will be bumping that up to tandem WOLED with a version that is coming soon. And that will also feature an increased brightness spec. So they're going to be bumping it up to True Black 600 class, very similar to what we've seen from some of the, I believe it was the 24.5-inch 1080p panel format. So 1700 nits peak brightness, 390 nits full screen brightness, and I believe they said the refresh rate is still going to be 165 Hz. They are also exploring higher refresh rates potentially in the near future. There's also going to be a 3440 by 1440 240 Hz refresh as well. No plans for RGB stripe though just yet, and I believe that panel is going to be available, the 45-inch tandem WOLED refresh, in the second quarter of 2027. So it's still a little way away, but they are working on a new version of that. The other thing I thought was really interesting was a direct side-by-side comparison between the two 32-inch 4K panel formats. They of course offer RGB stripe and the RGWB format, which has differences in brightness. So the RGWB panel can go up to 1300 nits peak and over 300 nits full screen brightness, and then the RGB stripe version, that only hits 1000 nits peak and 250 nits full screen. But there are some other benefits and differences. So while the RGWB version is brighter for white brightness, the RGB stripe version was noticeably more saturated and brighter in terms of color brightness. So one of the criticisms that we've seen from tandem WOLED and WOLED panels for a while has been that color brightness spec. It's not quite at the level we see from QD-OLEDs, but they are certainly improving that with the new RGB stripe panel version. So the equivalence that they were sort of suggesting is that RGWB, that will only increase color brightness up to around the 600 nit white level equivalent. With RGB stripe though, you're going to get 1000 nit color brightness equivalent. So that will mean that the color spec is going to be quite similar to QD-OLEDs that we've seen for a while now. So yeah, a bit brighter, a bit more saturation for the colors. However, there is a trade-off, and that comes in the form of color gamut. They're cutting that down from, I believe, something like 84% Rec 2020 to 80% on the RGB stripe version. And they tell us that's actually related to the panel's temperature, because the RGB stripe version has to be run a little harder because of the lack of the white subpixel. It needs to push out a bit more power, and that means the panel runs hotter, and the hotness of the panel is related to the color gamut. They can't get quite as much color gamut out of the warmer panel. So that was a quite interesting technical reason for why we see slightly different specs for each of the panels. But both of those panel formats will be available in 2026, and we're going to be testing them soon. The other thing we saw was panel level BFI technology, black frame insertion of course. They're not reintroducing this with anything that I would say is super interesting. A lot of people are requesting things like, different duty cycle levels with black frame insertion so that you can, display this picture for 10% of the time and then black for 90% of the time. They're still going with the 1-to-1 ratio for now, meaning that, every second frame is black, that sort of thing. However, LG Display believe that by introducing this at the panel level as opposed to the scalar level, that there are a couple of benefits. One of those is in terms of lag. The black frame insertion at the panel level is slightly less laggy, and they're also able to detect the BFI solution and provide higher brightness. So when it's done on the scalar level, that's just, the brightness of the panel. They can't bump everything up or whatever. That's just, it is what it is. But with the LG Display solution, they can go, oh, we can bump up the brightness of the picture frames, keep the other frames black, and we're not going to be dealing with too much burn-in, because on average, across the level of the two types of frame, you're going to get perfectly fine levels of brightness and therefore perfectly fine levels of image retention. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. And then lastly as well, at a little brief discussion just before we left LG Display, they were talking about some truly future technologies, things that we're expecting to see in 2028. So they were talking about a DFR 2.0 capability, which is going to bring a 4 times refresh rate version. So DFR is, of course, the dual frame rate or dual mode that we see on a lot of monitors. And typically what we see are things like 4K 240Hz and then 1080p 480Hz. That's a 2x DFR mode. LG Display is saying that in 2028, they're going to be offering a 4x mode. So that could mean a 4K panel at 240Hz, but then the dual mode would be 1080p at 960Hz. They say that is definitely possible. They were also talking about things like 1440p 540Hz, and then with the 4x DFR, a refresh rate of over, I think it was 2000 Hertz they were talking about, which I thought was like, whoa, crazy, 2000 Hertz. Anyway, 2028, they're talking about that. I think they said they're probably going to have to limit that down to more like 1000 Hertz or maybe a little over 1000 Hertz for the final versions, but certainly DFR 2.0 technology is coming in 2028. They're also going to be producing a version or a competitor to QD-OLED's triple mode functionality that we've seen here at the show. So with QD-OLED triple mode, they've got things like 4K 360 Hertz, they've got the 1440p, I think it was like 560 Hertz, and then 1080p 680 Hertz or something like that. What LG Display are working on is very similar things. So they were talking about, for example, having 4K 240 Hertz, 1440p 360 Hertz, 1080p 480 Hertz in a triple mode or even more mode sort of configuration. That technology will also be coming in 2028.
Also supporting our Computex coverage is Be Quiet and their excellent new range for 2026. Some of their latest offerings include power supplies like the Dark Power 6, AIOs such as the Pure Loop 3, additions to the light-based lineup, and a great selection of peripherals. Be Quiet's entire range is German designed, enjoying excellent build quality and silent performance. So for more information, please check the links in the video description.
So I think that is pretty much all for the LG Display announcements that we saw at their little, booth/private suite demo area. I thought all of these things were super, super interesting because not only were they willing to go on the record about some of the panel technologies that we're expecting in the near future, but also panel technology that's coming in a couple of years from now and all sorts of timelines and things for panels. So yeah, LG Display, they're not resting. One last thing I should probably mention is I did briefly talk to them about the gray banding issue that we've seen a lot across tandem WOLED panels. Didn't get too much information out of them outside of the usual, we're working on this, we're aware of that it's a issue with some of our panels and they're trying to resolve it for upcoming technologies, but no firm commitment or anything like that. So we'll have to still see how that goes with some of the future monitors that they're producing. But yeah, again, I really enjoy going to seeing LG Display, seeing all of the new technologies on show. That'll pretty much do it for this video. If you want to see more from our Computex 2026 coverage, we've got plenty of that right here on Monitors Unboxed. But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.